Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on the 2018 Compliance Survey results. To eliminate any background noise during the presentation, we ask that everyone please keep your microphones muted. This webinar will consist of a 55-minute presentation followed by a 5-minute question and answer session. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box throughout the webinar. Today's webinar is eligible for CTP and FP&A recertification credits. The credit forms, a copy of the deck, and the recording will be sent via email in the next 7 business days. Our presenters today are Senior Consultants Melody Hart and Stephanie Viatoro of Strategic Treasure. Welcome, Melody and Stephanie. I will now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you. To start, before we begin, there's a few ways you connect with us during and after today's webinar. So there's a chat box over at the right-hand side of your screen, and that's what you'll use for questions. We'll make our best efforts to answer them, but if we can't get them all answered, we will send an email later. And there's a box at the top of your screen where you can connect with us via LinkedIn, one of our groups, and finally, a way to connect during today's presentation, keep everyone engaged, is that we're going to have 4 polling questions throughout today's webinar, and that should hopefully keep everyone awake, because I know compliance is not always the topic that keeps one awake. So we've completed our compliance survey. This is actually our 5th year, and we'll review the results with you today. First, we'll talk about the survey itself, so you understand the demographics of who responded to the survey. And our goal is always to get a wide range of companies and industries and regional perspectives. So we'll go into demographics first. Next, we'll cover kind of a compliance landscape overview, including the corporate perspectives on compliance, what the top challenges are. After we set the stage from a high-level view, we'll dig in a little deeper into the components of compliance, like KYC requirements, and focusing on how big an issue this is for companies and how Treasury is coping. Then we'll update you on the ways companies manage FBAR today and the challenges the industry is facing. For OFAC, we'll discuss how sanctions are impacting and changing the world of Treasury payments. Then we'll move into a quick view of GDPR and bank account management. And to conclude today's webinar, we'll finish up with some final thoughts. So first, let's review what our process is for this survey. And you can see that up on the upper left. This survey life cycle spans about 6 months of time to complete. We take about 5 to 6 weeks reviewing the latest developments in compliance and researching them, then determining what questions should be included in this year's survey, if we should add additional questions. The survey this year is about 70 questions. So a lot of due diligence goes into compiling it. Once we open the survey, we leave it open for about 2.5 months because we want to get a broad range of respondents. We want them in all categories of companies and industries. We want them to be in different revenue segments so that we can really get a good range of companies. After that, we spend about 2 months analyzing the results because data is only good if you can present it where it's meaningful. So we do that analysis and present it to you in a more meaningful way. This is the 5th year, so that allows us year-to-year analysis and changes in the results, and these comparisons allow the changes in results to be identifiable and show where things are changing rapidly or where they're at a steady pace. So let's talk about the demographics. This year we had about 140 respondents in over 15 industries. So you can see on the right hand of the slide, upper right hand, the regions that it covered, and the respondents are very diverse. 93% have a U.S. presence, and then you have Latin America, Europe, and Asia Pacific being in the 45 to 57% range. So you can see you have a lot of multinationals here. On the bottom left, you can see the corporate treasury sizes. So it's almost evenly split amongst the 3 categories, interestingly enough. There's 32% with 3 or less, which we see as becoming a little more common. And then 4 to 10 is 35%, and above 11 is 34%. 58% of the respondents were at manager level or above, meaning AT, treasurer, and C-suite. So we had a good mix of people at good levels that have a lot of experience as well. Then in the bottom right-hand corner, we show the highest compliance concerns. So interestingly, the concerns have shifted somewhat, with KYC hitting the top of the list at 64%. FBAR is the second most concerning at 46%. And the others are relatively close to each other, GDPR and Dodd-Frank and OFAC. This is a quick reference of what we're covering in today's webinar, and we'll cover more of each of these concerns throughout the webinar today. Now that we've covered who is responding, what their concerns are, let's move into a little bit more detail. The corporate treasury landscape is becoming increasingly complex, and it's going to continue to grow in complexity, especially as risks continue to grow and new products continue to grow and cryptocurrencies grow. So bank administration is always a cumbersome part of Treasury. It's often pushed aside for more immediate concerns. The more countries a company does business in, banking partners and mere number of accounts is a direct correlation to the administrative effort it takes to manage and keep accurate records. Almost 70% of corporates in the survey use more than 3 banks in their headquarter country, and 43% use more than 6 banks internationally. So this adds to the complexity. But for each bank, there are multiple accounts, and almost half the companies manage more than 100 accounts across the globe. This can be a daunting task. The more accounts that need to be managed, the more administration and the more risk is involved. 2/3 of companies have international subsidiaries, and over half operate in more than 5 countries. And there are certain markets that we would say are riskier than others as well. They're more complex, like South America, the Middle East, or Africa. So these markets add to the complexity if these companies are in those markets. And you can see at the right-hand side of the slide the percentage of respondents that operate in these regions. So 45% of the respondents operate in South America, followed by 38% in the Middle East and 30% in Africa. So you can see that this adds a good deal of complexity and administration for these companies. But there are also other factors that add to the complexity for treasurers. Treasury staffs are typically staffed light, and over the years, as there's been more automation, they've gotten smaller. The staffs have gotten smaller. So it's not unusual for corporate treasury to have less than 3 employees. Like we said, it was 32% of the respondents had less than 3 and 53% less than 6. So keeping in mind that 42% of the respondents had annual revenues of over $2.5 billion and 45% were publicly traded, this says something in terms of the added complexity that they have, that they're getting smaller staffs and yet they're large companies as well. All these factors make it harder to deal with the changing compliance landscape. Stephanie, what are you seeing in the Treasury world as it relates to bank account management?
Thank you, Melanie, and welcome everyone to the webinar. So challenges in Treasury. We all have challenges in Treasury, and one of the biggest ones I think that you've mentioned is just resources, which typically surrounds around people resources or employees within the Treasury realm within an organization, especially as it tends to grow and become more global and more complex. So that added countries, those added bank accounts, the added regulatory requirements in each of those countries all make it more complex as they grow from a domestic company to a multinational organization. So the trends that I'm seeing out there today in that, as those organizations grow, they're obviously looking to automate as much as possible. So how do they do that, especially when it surrounds bank account management that you're talking about earlier? There's different ways, from going from those manual Excel-based processes or putting the bank account management on the side of the desk and just not worrying about it until they have time, which is never. They're looking more to streamline those processes. So how can they do that? It's through technology or outsourcing with different technology partners. whether it's a dedicated bank account management system that they're able to rely upon those in the field to enter in the bank account information as they change, and it reports up into, a consolidated treasury group, or also just having consolidated control in that regard, or outsourcing it. So this is a newer trend I'm seeing, is the outsourcing piece. I've seen it with bank account analysis, but now I'm seeing it with bank account management as well. They're outsourcing to third parties to handle the changes in their bank accounts, updating their bank accounts, as well as tracking them and reporting upon that. And it makes it more of a fluid process for FBAR reporting, which we'll talk about later. So that takes us to our first polling question. If you want to pull that in, and I'll hand it back over to Melody.
Okay, with regard to historical norms, the current level of regulatory oversight and compliance requirements impacting Treasury is, and there's a number of options: significantly higher, higher, about the same, lower, significantly lower, and unsure. It looks like they're coming in. Wow. So over 60%, well, it's bouncing around there, but it's around 60% are saying it's higher. It's about 80% when you say higher or significantly higher.
Yes, you are seeing that it is much higher. I don't know if we can make that bigger or not. But that's kind of the norm, that it is much higher. Cool.
Yeah, it is. And there is so much more that is required of companies now, and then when banks have their KYC, it ends up affecting the companies as well. So, okay, we can pull that question away. Oh, wait. Yeah, okay. Can you pull that question away? Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the state of compliance. Banks have always been regulated, and they've always been subject to a lot of compliance requirements, so much more than corporations. It's not that corporations aren't subject to significant and growing compliance requirements with OFAC and FBAR and GDPR, but banks have an even higher level of compliance because they are a regulated industry. The message to now is that some bank compliance requirements indirectly impact corporations. It's always important to remember that you can't just look at what is impacting a corporation. You have to look at what things a bank is going to have to be regulated on that will impact you, because they'll be asking you for something. So it's something that treasurers need to understand. It's not just compliance on corporates, it's compliance on banks that affects you. For instance, corporates are affected by bank compliance requirements like Dodd-Frank or KYC. These are requirements for the bank, but it's the companies that have to also provide the information. So it adds to already heavy compliance requirements. As you can see in the survey results, 76% of banks and 68% of corporates saw the compliance environment as either higher or significantly higher, which isn't that different from what we just saw. I think it was a little bit higher on the population who was listening. Also significantly, on the right-hand side of the screen, not a single bank or corporation thought the compliance environment was less stringent than in the past. And I think that differs a little bit on our polling question as well. So think about the various compliance requirements: OFAC, FBAR, Dodd-Frank, KYC, SWIFT CSP, GDPR, all these things. With each new regulation, the impact has to be assessed and a plan made to deal with compliance. All of these are adding workload to Treasury departments with limited resources. Stephanie, do you have any other additional thoughts on compliance positions?
Yes, I think it's been a varying response from the corporate world. I won't speak to the banking as much, but on the corporate side, I've seen some varying results here, more from the aspect of the more global you become and the more compliance requirements that you have, which I know we're going to talk about GDPR later and how that impacts different types of companies throughout the world. But I have seen companies hire a specific position for just compliance, in order to stay abreast, in order to have processes in place. And I've also seen it kind of spread among many different people within the group with maybe one that's oversight. So those are the different things that I've seen. And I know we have another polling question coming in right now. And for the polling question, there were some questions in the chat box. You do just click the little radio button and it will automatically take your vote. No need to submit. If you could make that a little bit larger. So here's, what is the most concerning aspect of the current regulatory environment today for you? Time and effort, ongoing costs, the financial cost of maintaining that. That's those new positions. The threat of any types of penalties for not being compliant, new regulations, and then are you not worried? Are there others? Melody, I'm going to hand this back over to you while people are addressing this.
Yeah, it looks like time and effort seems to be winning out here, which you know, speaks to the fact that if you have less resources, it really becomes a big issue. Financial cost is second there, though, but it's not nearly as high of an importance as the time and effort. So, so it looks like the time and effort is the greatest concern for companies.
Yes, it does.
Okay, can we move the? There we go. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the main concerns of compliance is, here we had that same question, and look at how similar, although I think we had a little higher on time and effort here. The main concerns of compliance are cost, effort, penalties, and more regulations, but the two most interesting data points on this chart are on the left and the right. On the left, the first thing to note is that most of the concerns, well, if you look at the 2, 3, and 4, those concerns, both banks and corporates are not far apart, and they're all of less concern than the first one. The single most concerning aspect of the compliance environment is the effort. So 53% of banks voice this concern, and only 39% of corporates. So it differs a little bit. Of course, we have to remember that on our question that we give, our polling question, we aren't differentiating between banks and corporates in that, whereas in our survey we do. So 39% isn't low, though, but it is a difference between banks and companies. On the right-hand side of the screen, if you take a look at it, not a single bank was unworried about the current compliance environment, while 10% of corporates were not overly worried. However, on the corporate side, it was that had little concern. It was mostly smaller domestic companies. If you move to the center of the slide, the three sets of bars, 2, 3, and 4, show the ongoing cost, how that is a concern. That is second, again, just like it was in the polling question. And the other two are third and fourth, the threat of penalties and fear of regulation. Those are 3 and 4, just like on the polling questions. Interestingly, the fear of being more regulations being introduced, I think it's very interesting that it's only 10% of banks and corporates. So Stephanie, what are your thoughts about the effort it takes for compliance? People, systems, new and developing?
I'll talk a little bit about that. Just people in general, it's a manual process when you're starting something that's new. It takes a lot more time to get your arms around it in the beginning. But once it's developed, any type of new compliance is developed within the corporation, but also within the regulatory environment, as well as the response from technology vendors and banks that are offering different services to assist with it, whether it's outsourcing, whether it's internal, that you're just, adding another service on from a bank or from a third-party processor or vendor that helps with that process, it becomes less and less. So I would say in the beginning, it's a lot more than it is later in the end.
Okay, thanks, Steph. That's good information. The ways companies respond to compliance requirements varies, and this kind of addresses that. It's become such a burden that nearly a third of the companies have put in place a dedicated regulatory team at the corporate level. And it's pretty significant, I would say. a third of the companies would do that because that is a higher cost and it's a dedicated person. But not all companies have that. And another quarter of the companies have treasury handling it by either having one individual assigned or splitting the responsibilities between several individuals. For instance, perhaps they give Dodd-Frank compliance to the FX people and they give KYC to the cash management people. So given the amount of work involved in compliance, it's kind of surprising that less than 10% of companies engage a third party to help manage it. But a significant number of corporations, 26%, don't have a plan in place for monitoring or managing regulations. Now, these are primarily small domestic firms. Although regulations can affect small domestic firms, but obviously things like FBAR would not, and GDPR may not. But as times change, as regulations change, these companies may be affected as well at some point. Stephanie, what have you been seeing amongst companies in terms of awareness on planning for compliance?
Like today, we have different educational seminars, webinars, conferences, and things to stay abreast of that. And you also see different things in the news that makes people stay up at night as well, that makes you want to stay in compliance. The most recent one kind of around FBAR there. But it's more just trying to research, stay abreast, keep yourself educated on what is going on, and taking that internally of your company to determine what you need to be compliant with. Regulatory compliance items will be applicable to different companies. But that's what I'm seeing there.
Okay. Okay, we have another polling question. If you could bring that up. Okay, select the top 3 compliance requirements that you're most concerned about. Looks like KYC is leading the pack with FBAR second.
Which is what we saw at the beginning on the very first slide. We saw KYC was of the top concern.
Yeah, one difference
is
yeah, on the beginning slide, GDPR was third, I believe. Dodd-Frank maybe fourth, and here they're it's kind of switched. Dodd-Frank is third here, but it's actually very close to FBAR. So it's interesting, a little bit different than the other results.
It could be a mix of corporates and bankers that are on the line. So we may have a heavier banker presentation or presence today on the webinar.
Yeah,
I'll broadcast those results so we can see the percentages there.
Okay, so
we still have a few people answering, but I'll end it.
There you
go. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you can see it was 82% for KYC. That was quite a bit. 50% for FBAR. So as we've mentioned in other presentations on compliance, sometimes it's a matter of fighting the alligators that are closest to your boat. So we see that as some regulations are adopted and processes are put in place, the concern about them tends to reduce, while newer regulations and regulations with significant penalties end up getting higher on the list of concerns. So you can see that GDPR has moved on the left because that's a new regulation that people are still somewhat trying to work through. SWIFT CSP, Basel 3.4, Section 385 PSD2 have a low percentage of response concerned because they've been around longer and probably have processes in place. FATCA and PCI DSS are moderate in concern. The areas of most concern are riskier, and they have negative impacts for noncompliance. One of them, the new one, GDPR, companies may or may not have processes in place yet, which may directly impact the response of why they are more concerning. Because when you think of it, you have to actually protect information on EU citizens. differently than you do for other populations. You know, you may not have the systems in place to do that. You know, it takes time and programming and a lot of effort to make that work. It's interesting that the two compliance areas of the highest concern were both centered around bank administration issues. So with bank KYC, it's a concern for 64% of companies. And FBAR, a concern for a little less than half the companies. But bank administration is a necessary but administratively intensive function that eats up time and resources in the company. And both of these have an element of bank administration. With the concern about the amount of effort and time, this function adds significant pressure on the resources at Treasury. KYC, this process is cumbersome and has become so cumbersome over the number of years that opening accounts is no longer a small task and can take a long time. And this is even more true when it's an international account. FBAR challenges center largely on accurately tracking U.S. signers. Often foreign subsidiaries are not attuned to the U.S. requirements and may be lax on tracking the information, and companies have found that's been a challenge for them when they're trying to collect the information. But they're both centered on bank administration. The next three, GDPR, Dodd-Frank, and OFAC, are not far apart. GDPR requires that any company has information on an EU resident has to meet certain conditions and requirements. They have to have explicit permission to hold the information from the individual. It must specify each piece of information. It must be encrypted at rest and in transit. And an individual has the right to demand to be forgotten and have their information purged. So companies with concerns about this will typically be companies who have EU employees but are not limited to employee data. Dodd-Frank and OFAC sanctions are still a concern. OFAC penalties can be onerous, but there's an increasing number of payment programs, systems that will do the checking for you. Steph, can you cover some of the results on KYC and some of the other compliance issues?
Yes, I can cover some of those. I'm not surprised that KYC and FBAR are obviously of LA concern here in the red area. They are very onerous when it does come to bank account management and tracking. The one positive I would say that FBAR has brought to the world of Treasury is more accurate tracking of your bank accounts, not only just tracking who the current signers are, but who's been a signer. One of the cumbersome things I think that is still out there is what is technically a signer when it is in from a compliance perspective with FinCEN, and it's not our typical terminology in the banking world or in the Treasury world, where a signer on an account is someone who had authority on a signature card. That is not the definition of an FBAR signer. I think they should have used a different term here in order to clarify this more easily for those that try to pick it apart and say different things. So I wish that was just more clear there. So that's had some positive reactions in the Treasury world there. As far as KYC, it's a necessary evil in my mind. We do need to do this. I'll age myself a little. I was in the banking world and the Treasury world before KYC was required, and now that it is, I've had to go through that transition. It was a difficult one, but I think it's, like I said, a necessary evil for the purpose of it. And one of the biggest challenges over time has been giving up that personal information sometimes for the know your customer requirements. That takes us over. Were there any other comments on this, Melody, or I'll move on to the next slide?
No, I will say I do remember early in my career when I would call the bank and say, can you open an account today? And they would. You'd send them a letter and a signer card. That's all you had to do. So it has changed considerably.
And overseas, I would do it by fax.
Yep.
same difference. I had the same thing. So going on, not only does KYC here on this slide include a lot of time and effort that we've talked about for Treasury staff when you're opening up a new account, it's also creating other operational issues. From this slide of our survey results, you can see the magnitude of the operational issues. We see 55% have experienced either some delays or significant delays in their new vendor payments. So it's not just opening accounts, this has to do with payments as well. And 32% have had vendors rejected by their banking partners as part of their bank's due diligence process. So having payments delayed or vendors rejected, it's going to be disruptive to companies, and it's not going to help your relationships with external partners. So when this type of KYC and OFAC checking began earlier in my career, as I said, I can recall a payment every month that used to go through, but when this started, one particular vendor was stopped every month by the bank. This is before information was saved or collected by the bank for a particular payee and recorded as safe to pay. And luckily, I had this individual was very understanding every month, which isn't always the case. So even though it's a challenge, KYC, like I said, is a necessary evil for banks. The implementation of this can be somewhat different bank by bank when they're checking, which results in some banks wanting more information than others for sensitive data. With KYC, companies need to plan on a longer timeline for setting up accounts and transactions. Meeting with your banks as part of the bank admin process to ensure that you're fully apprised of what their process is, and information requirements can also help smooth that process, especially when you're opening accounts that are not domestic. So that brings us to our last polling question of today. If you want to bring that into the window. So have banks ever asked for overly sensitive information related to KYC documentation that felt you uncomfortable divulging or felt it was very unnecessary? I know I've dealt with this where I've had CFOs and treasurers refuse to give me their passports or personal documentation around proving who they are early on. It's gotten easier over time, I think, for people because of the requirements become more well-known. So we're seeing here that, a couple times seems to be leading, but frequently it's leading. Once or twice second, and never is obviously the least. Does it surprise you, Melody?
No, that doesn't surprise me. I've had people say that in the industry that they've found that more and more they're being asked things they don't really feel as necessary or don't feel as appropriate.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you want to move that out of the viewing area of the poll. Thank you. So we'll move on now. So now that KYC is that necessary component for banks to complete in today's environment, what other concerns do we have that accompany with it? On the left, you can see that 64% of respondents feel that there have been times when they have been asked for overly sensitive information, just like we saw in our polling question just now. Of that population, 72% of these respondents ultimately had to provide the information. So no matter what, you still have to give it. I recall during this transition, like I said, people refusing to provide it. And it doesn't make it very easy to sit in between the bank and the Treasury group or the CFO trying to get that information to open an account that you have to open up. One important point when thinking of compliance is there are regulations on banks that have distinct indirect impacts on companies as well. KYC is one of those, as evidenced here with Dodd-Frank. The Treasury must really stay up to date, not only on regulations impacting them directly like FBAR, but also those that impact the banking industry. Melody, I'm going to pass this to you for a second. What do you see are some of the concerns out there or main concerns for individuals that they have for providing that sensitive information?
Yeah, a lot of times it's that it is personal information, and they don't feel that it's necessary that they have to provide that just for opening an account for which, it's not their own account. So, they feel somewhat offended that they're having to provide it. But you often have to anyway. They also worry about the storage of the data, like where's, if I have to provide all this information, where's it going to go? and how long will it stay there, and how do I know that other people don't get it? But unfortunately, it does end up being required to be given to the banks.
Okay, thank you for that. So moving on, FBAR has been around, obviously, for quite a while, long enough that you'd think it would be common knowledge by now. But the fact is that it's had so many changes and delays that it's caused a lot of confusion across the board. We're still seeing a significant percentage here, 40%, that have limited knowledge. You know, there's a hotline for the IRS that's concerning FBAR, and in the beginning, Melody shared with me that she used to get different answers from the FBAR hotline at the IRS, depending on who answered the call. And it's improved over time. She says that, you know, more clarity is gotten on this topic, they have on this topic at the IRS, so it's, you know, things are changing and it's getting better. But there's frequent changes to the timing and the filing in the past. It's created that confusion overall. So for enforcement, it's really unclear how this information is going to be used in the future, except for those few high-profile incidents in the use of FBAR against, for example, Paul Manafort. So it's still a top concern we've seen. There's no clarity of how it's going to be enforced, and as we mentioned before, it's going to require a significant effort to compile that data annually, and that's what we're seeing across the board. Mel, do you have any thoughts about that in the FBAR area, what you're seeing with companies?
Yeah, what we're seeing is, you know, more companies are getting on board with doing it now that they've kind of solidified the deadlines, and they're trying to find their way through how to keep this information current. You know, most companies are still on spreadsheets with a lot of this stuff, and even if they have part of it automated, most companies don't have all of it automated. You know, it's not a fully automated process, so they keep trying to work through this and understanding the signers and who are the signers, the question about whether it should be, you know, your wire signer, which it should. You know, they have to go through all those segments to learn enough about it and implement it. But more and more companies are, and more companies are starting to look at automation. And some are outsourcing, you know, getting rid of a headache like this. So there's any number of ways that they're handling it now.
Thank you, Melody. So that's going to take us now to how companies are planning to file for FBAR for their individual signers. I know there's a couple questions in the chat box we'll try to answer here in a second. About 1/3 of respondents have no plans to file on behalf of their individual employees. A little under half of those who don't plan to file do not think that they are required to file. And another third plan to file for their employees or provide information to them so that they can file, but they haven't done so far yet. And this relates to one of the questions, yes, that goes on your personal tax returns as well. You do have to check that box if you are a corporate signer on a foreign account. And 41% that plan to file for their employees or have filed for their employees. So about 1/4 of practitioners have filed for their signers and have completed the FBAR requirements, only 1/4 of them. This is really low, or relatively low, considering the number of years this requirement's been out there. And it's likely due because of that confusion surrounding the FBAR date of filing, because they kept delaying it for so long, and the difficulty of obtaining the information as well as maintaining it. This is where we've seen companies start to outsource, or companies start to use systems and things like that for their FBAR requirements. Moving on. So now that we've discussed the FBAR knowledge and reporting, we're going to move into the data aggregation of the processes companies have in place. So for those who are filing or planning to file, you can see with the red bar and the 2 blue bars immediately adjacent to the right, 88% have, actually that's to the left, 88% have manual or semi-manual processes, with 39% that are completely manual. This puts significant pressure on Treasury resource workloads. Those 3 bars we mentioned are mutually exclusive, But the other blue bars are not, and address how some of this information is being automated. The respondents could select more than one response on those different ones. So a fifth, or 1 out of 5, are using a bank account management system where they're getting balance fees. Another 1 out of 5 are using a treasury management system that can report the information to the right format needed. And another 1 out of 5 are exporting the data out of the TMS and reformatting it. And a small percentage of 4% are using a treasury aggregator for that data. So one of the areas that may be causing that increased concern is that delayed filing that we have talked about not occurring anymore. So they're not delaying it anymore. So now that it must be filed on time on April 15th, companies are struggling with getting all that information to the individuals and compiling it that they were doing on a delayed basis before. So that puts more pressure on Treasury and the tax departments, depending on who's handling it, to handle this quicker. Some things that we're seeing today is actually people auditing their banks for those balances as well if they don't have that automated reporting. Now, OFAC sanctions are particularly concerning for companies that operate in third world countries with areas of heavy terrorism or criminal activity. We see this often in Africa, South America, and Middle East and Asia. Our survey indicates here that about half of the respondents that are aware of the penalties, they don't see it as a threat. Many companies are using sanctions filtering as part of their payment, and a quarter know the penalties and consider it a threat. Another quarter is not aware of the penalties of failure to comply. We also see that approximately a third have had their banks notify them of a potential violation, while 2/3 have never had their bank notify them of a potential violation. So Melody, what are you seeing with the reporting from banks today? Is it required that they report to their customers?
They would report to their customers, but you never know when sometimes something slips by them, you know, maybe a process isn't followed, but most of the time they will report. So it could just be that the people who have said that they hadn't gotten one is because they didn't have anything that was concerning. One thing to remember, though, is that while banks do screen most payments, recent legislation has made a violation a lot more onerous to companies, where it's found they look at who is the most negligent in a violation, and that's the party that would be assessed the fine. So if the bank has checked it and hasn't told you, and you are still trying to continue with the same process that you have, and you're not checking yourself, it kind of brings it more back to, are you more negligent for not checking and just counting on the bank to do it for you?
True, and I think that's my next slide. So I know that's okay. Now that we've discussed those concerns around OFAC already, we'll get into it a little bit more here on that sanctions screening workflow in this slide. So how are companies handling it today? In our survey, we see that over half have a dedicated process that's outside of their banks for screening, which is really good. And the majority of us handle it internally by screening against different lists. So they're doing it internally there. About 10% use a third party to outsource the screening, and a third of them don't screen at all. For those that don't screen, there's risks, which you just mentioned, Melody, around the recent violation that whoever's found most negligent in the violation of the party, that's the person or the entity that will be assessed the penalty. So a company relying solely on the bank and not screening themselves is at an increased risk of being found the most negligent and the sole responsible party for any penalties around that. So it's important to note that sanctioned screening products are available out there and can be purchased from Treasury aggregators or from even TMS providers. There still seems to be a lot of confusion, though, around GDPR. You've mentioned that a couple times, and practitioners struggle to comply with it. About a third of companies are trying to determine the applicability of GDPR in Treasury. Mostly, you will think of this as applying it to marketing, like Amazon would be to affecting as they sell all over, or employee payroll in the EU. But it can also affect Treasury in a number of different ways. Wire payments that are made by Treasury that are to EU individuals, that's the European Union, or bank signer information for those European Union signers. Treasury departments are identifying whether or not they need to maintain the data, and they're finding ways to reduce optional personal data. This is going to help reduce the issue for the need of compliance. And companies are also trying to achieve compliance with, we see 14% here of companies working to document the reasons for capturing and storing personal data for payments, and a comparable percentage documenting the reasons for capturing and storing personal data for bank account management. The red bars on the left show that 37% of companies weren't aware of what their company was doing to comply with GDPR, and 17% don't believe it's relevant since they're not headquartered in Europe. So just a quick comment on this. Being headquartered outside of Europe does not mean a company is not covered by GDPR. It is a regulation that applies to any company who stores and uses personal information of citizens in the European Union anywhere within the company. An example of this would be a company would have to be concerned with this regulation if they were a domestic company with no operations in Europe, no individuals who were in the European Union, or vendors, and no employees. That they wouldn't be concerned with it at all in that regard. So I want to pass it back over to Melody for the next slide here as we're finishing up this webinar.
Okay. Well, on this slide, let me flip it here so you get the slide. Well, you already flipped it, didn't you? Thank you. Okay, on this slide, you'll note that the percentage of companies who feel their processes are well controlled on bank account management is only 22%. 51% of think their process is pretty good, but it needs improvement. And 23% feel that they are poorly controlled. And that's slightly more than those that feel that the process is well controlled. Because many regulations are tied to bank account administration like KYC and FBAR, it's important to assess where you stand in this area. Obviously, for domestic-only companies where the number of banks and accounts might be a limited number, that would not be as critical, but larger companies will have more bank accounts, and multinational organizations can have dozens of banks and hundreds of accounts spanning across the globe. So with several signers per account, the tracking of signers and accounts with manual processes is very difficult. Let's consider the issues in bank account administration. Most processes are manual, as we saw earlier in this presentation, and that becomes a major headache for companies with many bank accounts to track. So an automated solution would significantly improve managing the workload and would reduce the errors and the risks. While spreadsheets will always be with us in some capacity in Treasury, I can't imagine a time when they wouldn't be, tracking bank accounts and signers is an area that really can benefit from automation of any of the areas of Treasury, besides, of course, cash positioning as well. Having automation for bank administration is important. Stephanie, do you see more companies going toward automation?
Definitely, I do. I see dedicated systems, modules within a treasury management system, as well as outsourcing. Outsourcing parties use systems as well. So I do see this.
Okay. So this next slide speaks to the manual nature of bank administration in most companies. So if you look at the red bars, surprisingly, 23% of firms use paper files, do not have a BAM process. This puts these companies at a high risk because their processes are not well controlled. Now, if they have few accounts, it might not be a big issue, but when you have many accounts, this could be a pretty large issue for you. Not surprisingly, 67% use spreadsheets. However, some of these companies who use spreadsheets may also be using some automation for part of the process. As we can see, there are other areas that could be automated. Maybe you're getting the balances, the high balances. Maybe you're getting, certain aspects of the bank administration in a TMS. So 8% used a dedicated bank account administration system. So they are automated. 36% use TMS, either SaaS or installed, that has a BAM module for a portion of the process anyway. And in-house products and legal entity systems account for 23% of partial automation. Still, with only 8% on a dedicated system, that means the other methods provide partial automation rather than full automation. So spreadsheets are often still needed in the process workflow. Some final thoughts on compliance. First, compliance is difficult, particularly since changes have been rapid and processes and systems in companies have not been keeping pace with that change. Keeping track of revisions, that's difficult, and let's face it, getting funds to automate means competing against the profit-creating parts of the business for finite IT resources. However, the time has come where that has become a little bit easier. Where it's garnering the attention of the company is in the compliance area, because compliance has been a double-edged sword for Treasury. It has created cumbersome workflows, but it's also heightened senior management's awareness of the risk of not investing in Treasury infrastructure. KYC will continue to cause headaches at banks. As banks continue to roll out their processes, they're forced to spend an immense amount of money and time handling the documentation. But a lot of that, as we said before, is also indirectly impacting corporations. So this has created long processing delays, and corporations are reluctantly having to divulge high levels of sensitive information to banks. We don't expect this to decrease anytime in the future. But most importantly, we think as a final thought is it's key to develop a formalized approach. Treasury has been forced through regulation to play a more active role with compliance, and that environment is expected to grow in complexity and stringency. So having a plan in place to monitor regulation and manage it requires clear and efficient workflows for information gathering and handling and for tracking shifting regulations. Some companies assign this to a specific individual in Treasury, others divvy it up depending on the regulation. What is key is that monitoring is assigned to specific individuals for accountability rather than just to be a general departmental thought. That way action plans can be developed prior to the regulation being enforced. It's incumbent on Treasury to be on top of the regulations that impact not only them but banks, because this is how they add value to the company. Even though it is compliance, it adds value if they are prepared. That is all for today for our presentation. If there are any questions, I don't know if we have, how much time do we have?
We have a few more minutes. You can put your questions in the chat box, but I'll hand it over to Meredith to close us out on contact information. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for attending today's webinar, and thank you, Melody and Stephanie, for an informative presentation. We will stay online for a few more minutes in case there are any last-minute questions. For anyone interested in more survey data, click on the link below on the slide to take the 2019 Treasury Perspective Survey, which is sponsored by TD Bank. Again, thanks everyone for joining us today. For upcoming webinars, please continue to check our website, or you can join our LinkedIn Treasury group. Thanks so much.